Cassidy, is that you? Yeah, it's amazing. You look so good. Um, I love the illustration.
Oh, thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Um, so last time we reviewed the syllabus. Are there any questions that bear on the syllabus that you might have? Okay, I guess just briefly to recapitulate, there are the lectures, there are the review questions. Those will be the final examination questions, take home. And I will be reviewing those questions as we go along. Like today, we're hopefully going to be dealing with the question of what is a civilization? That's the first review question. So I'll give the lecture, but maybe the next time we start, I'll go back and to this review question to make sure you sort of understand what I'm looking for in the way of an answer, possible answer or possible question on the final examination. And then there is the other 70%, which is basically in 3 stages, the development of a term paper, relatively short, but through 3 successive stages. The first stage of which is due on the 11th of February, and it simply is a series of questions based on the required books, Heller and Banerjee in particular. So that's due on the 11th of February. I think that more or less takes care of the syllabus. I would point out, I see on the CBC that there's this report today that 1/3 of Canadians are depressed. Things are bad. Obviously, they're bad. Who isn't suffering? But it is said, I was told, that UMSU, amongst the things that they provide for are psychological or psychotherapeutic services. And you shouldn't hesitate. It's free. And of course, there are a lot of kinky people who are in psychology. So you have to watch out. But you can find a therapist who can actually help you. And I would explore that if you can. So with that, we're going to get seriously into the material of the course today. Let's begin by noting that, of course, this is a course in global history, first year course, entry-level course in the history department. And it's notable that we're the history department at the University of Manitoba, like many other places, offers this kind of a course. Now, if you were to turn the clock back to, say, the 1950s in Manitoba, and you looked at the university curriculum, particularly the history department offerings at the University of Manitoba in the 1950s, you would find that the introductory level course would have been English history, a survey of English history. Today we teach global history. Back then they taught as an introduction English history. Why on earth would they teach English history? England today is a second, if not third-rate power. It's, whatever the English may think, they're still waiting for Churchill to return. What's that? Why did they teach here in Western Canada English history as the introductory class. Anybody have any idea? Willing to take a chance? Answer my question. Any thoughts about this? Savin notes that these people, the English, had a lot of influence back then. Could you elaborate a little bit on the English and say the situation in Canada still in the 1950s? And what was English? Where did that come from? The sort of English influence. What's it all about? I think some of you know, but are just holding back.
Canada, the UK Canada is technically a sovereign nation of Her Queen Majesty of Elizabeth. So that's the correlation.
That's it. Canada, of course, was and still is part of the British Commonwealth, and moreover, as somebody noted, way back, England had a lot of influence. If you went back several decades before, say, to the beginning of the 20th century, and looked at a map of the world, the large parts of the world were painted red. The English, that is to say, in English colors, the English had colonized the huge parts of the world, amongst other places, Canada, but of course, a place like India. India only gained its independence in 1948, and there are lots of other countries. So that, of course, then what I've just said more or less explains the situation. But then the situation changed. Starting in the 1960s, and you can actually do the research that demonstrates this. If you looked at the curriculum at the University of Manitoba, English history became more, it was still taught, but it was not, it was displaced as this central offering. And instead, something called the history of Western civilization took its place. Or sometimes its history of Western civilization was called From Plato to NATO, which is itself very suggestive. Why do we have a change from teaching English history to teaching the history of Western civilization? Anybody have any thoughts about that? Well, to put it bluntly, it was the American influence. These courses in Western civilization started at Columbia and Harvard, basically right after World War I. And after the Second World War, this Western civilization course became the standard course in American universities. Well, the university system that we have in Canada today basically developed from the 1950s, 60s onwards under the shadow of American influence. That wasn't happening merely in Canada, it was happening all over Europe and beyond, places like Australia and New Zealand. In other words, the emergence, the full emergence of American, not merely economic power, but political power. And the framework for that was, in terms of the historical conceptions, was the overall unity of what was something called Western civilization, which significantly included, of course, Europe, but also Canada and the United States above all. And these courses in Western civilization, which are still taught today, that's an offering in the here at the University of Manitoba, and continues to has a certain value. And it's this course on Western civilization, as it was rationalized by the people who put it forward, were supposed to teach the basic values of the great Western civilization, namely the worth of the individual, democracy, rationalism, progress, science, and so on. And it was very clear that the development of this course had a lot to do with the rise of American power in the context of the Cold War between the United States and its allies and the Soviet Union and its allies. The Soviet Union was the other as compared to the values of Western civilization. Well, finally, we come to the late 70s, 80s, and so on, and we begin to see the emergence of global history. Courses begin to be taught in global history. And the teaching of global history has become stronger and stronger. I would say at this point, in terms of sort of setting the basic framework for the study of history, certainly in the Americas and in Europe, it's global history today. Why is it global history? Why this interest in global history? Well, the world has become global. Even though, of course, there are some powers, namely the United States, which is still the dominant power in the world, the reality is, from an economic, from a cultural, and from a political point of view, the world is increasingly integrated, and it becomes increasingly to conceive of the world simply in this compartmentalized way increasingly makes less and less sense. And so you have the emergence of what we call global history. Are there any comments or questions about what I just said? Okay. Now, yes, I want to now, as this world history developed and so on, a criticism of it developed within this context of globalization that I'm talking about. Certain people began to complain, particularly people from the global south, from the third world and so on. Their complaint was that whatever people said about global history, nevertheless, the problem was that history was still taught from a European or Western point of view. And they complained of what they called, I'm speaking about something called today that's still a current called post-colonialism and so on, especially from the global South. The idea that, well, it could be world history, but it's all about, Western colonialism, Western imperialism, Western domination, Western cultural domination, et cetera, et cetera. Even capitalism is essentially Western, so they say. That's poppycock, but that's what's said. Now, I just want to say something about this notion of Eurocentric. Well, first of all, we can say that I've been talking about capitalism, the development of capitalism. And it is true that capitalism, as it first appeared, and particularly the social relations of capitalism between capitalists and workers, this appeared in Western Europe, and particularly in places like Holland and England at the beginning of the 16th century. That's perfectly true, but we should understand from the get-go, from the beginning, capitalism was a world system. And one of the important aspects of this the world system was money. That you cannot have a world market without some form of common exchange. And that initial and still fundamental form, regardless of Bitcoin, I'm very skeptical, etc., that world money is rooted in gold and silver, bullion, gold and silver, precious metals. Where did this come from? Well, the overwhelming bulk of it was produced in Latin America. And without that Latin American supply of gold and silver, there could have been no capitalism. So that's an important point in terms of sort of getting away from the idea that capitalism is Eurocentric. Now, another aspect of this is that what's the big deal? I already told you that capitalism is in crisis at this point. Now, I know that many people in this class firmly believe that capitalism is the future. But there are a whole series of factors which are have developed, which are self-contradictory within the capitalist system. And one of these is, and central to it, is consumerism. It is consumerism, the reality and the possibility of consumption, going to Walmart, going to Costco, et cetera, being able to consume is the central attraction for the masses. It still is, not merely here in Winnipeg, but everywhere in the world. Like we see this unfortunate case here, these people who froze to death from Gujarat in India, trying to cross the border. And it's explained they were already rich in India, these people. They had lots of money, but they wanted a higher level of consumption. And it ended in a tragedy, but the point I'm making is people are fixated on this. Well, frankly, we are drowning in consumption. It's a basic contradiction of the system. The ecological crisis that we're in, and which is deepening, is based on essentially overproduction, massive production, overproduction. Usually, especially in the advanced capitalist countries, beyond the needs of people. And ultimately, it's just, if it continues, we will literally drown in this overconsumption. So my point is that what's the big deal? Like as if capitalism is the be all and end all. No, it's becoming problematic. And finally, I would say that, yes, it's true that Paris and London and ultimately New York, these have been the center of the world under capitalism. Well, you want to know about that. Where is the center of the system? You need to know that. It happens that it's not in the global south. It's in these most advanced capitalist countries. In order to do history realistically, you have to know where the headquarters of the whole system is. Well, it happens to be in these places: Berlin, Paris, New York, etc. So that's my point about Eurocentric. The next point is sort of an extension of what I've been saying, and bears on being able to do global history properly. Now, here in Winnipeg, what we see in Winnipeg, a city which is what, 800,000 people, 900,000 people? Well, its composition has changed dramatically in the last generation or so, in the sense that people from all over the world have come to Winnipeg, seeking a better life, trying to get on the bandwagon of consumerism, and they have been allowed into the country of Canada in order to work. That's why the Canadian government allows immigrants in. The birth rate is not sufficient to constitute the workforce. So people from all over the world. And of course, it's deeply enriched Winnipeg as a city. The people from everywhere with their different ways of life, their different religions, their different foods. Winnipeg has become an extremely interesting city from that point of view. However, this is true. Of course, this process is not exclusive to Winnipeg. You would see it in Montreal, you'd see it in Toronto, you'd see it in New York, you'd see it in Los Angeles, etc. But one of the features, one of the aspects of this is that people love their own cultures. People love their own cultures. They're very attached to them. They're attached to their way of life, their religion, the sort of particularities of their family lives and of their communities, their customs, and so on. And some, to the extent of believing, they come with the idea, and this is an idea which is deeply rooted in different nations, in different cultures, all over the world, even before the times that we lived in. That is to say, the belief of different peoples, whether you go to India, whether you go to China, whether you go to the Middle East, whether you go to Europe and to the different states of Europe, the Germans, the French, the English, they all believe in the sort of that their culture is better than the culture of other people. It's sort of a vulgar, idea that people have of themselves. And we call that, the term that's used to sort of cover that kind of attitudes, we're superior and you're inferior, is called ethnocentrism. Ethnos in Greek means people. And the different people think of themselves in this way. And sure enough, when you look at, say, what the Europeans thought in the 16th century, because in the first place, because the Europeans were Christians and the rest of the world was not Christian, well, they thought that the rest of the world were savage, barbarian, pagan, etc. And likewise, you could say if you were in China, the Chinese, they had this idea that they were at the center of the world. And China was the center of the world. In fact, there was a certain justification for that. But nevertheless, it was a deeply rooted idea in China, and it actually became problematic over time because China began to enter more and more deeply into contact with the rest of the world, and the rest of the world, and particularly the Westerners, especially with their guns, showed the Chinese a different story. And it took the Chinese centuries to adjust themselves. So this idea of ethnocentrism, getting over that and taking a more cosmopolitan view of the world is central to sort of understanding the world that we live in, and certainly understanding the course that we're in. Are there any comments or questions about what I've said? Okay, now I want to consider the whole question of what we call culture. Culture, which plays a central role in, because we're looking at different, basically, civilizations or cultures. It's important to sort of understand what this idea of culture is all about. And so I want to discuss it, its various meanings. Now, the term, well, to begin with, I mean, I'm putting a lot of stress on getting you to understand what capitalism is all about. And capitalism, certainly, as you see from the questions I've asked, it centers in on economic and social relations. And perhaps a look at the state, but it's the economy and the social relation classes in society, which are how people make a living. And that's fundamental, of course, in all civilizations and all cultures and so on. And so no less so than under capitalism. And certainly there are certain economic characteristics of capitalism. However, capitalism itself and other modes of production, as we call it, other ways of making a living, and capitalism certainly has not been eternal, as I've tried to explain. It appears around 1500. But before that, there was feudalism, or what we call the tributary mode. And in this mode, productivity was much lower than it subsequently became under capitalism. And instead of capitalists and workers, the basic social relations were between landlords who collected rents, lived off the rents that had to be paid by the peasants. Most people were peasants under feudalism, and they were forced, in order to exploit the land, to pay rent to the landlord. But even prior to this so-called feudalism or tributary mode, there was what we call the hunting and gathering mode. That is to say, people made their living essentially by hunting and gathering. And of course, the tributary mode, the hunting and gathering mode is still with us. 100 miles from Winnipeg, there are still people whose essential way of life is essentially still, even though they have supplementary sources of income, their basic way of life is hunting and gathering. Hunting gathering has not disappeared. No, it's still with us. And something like 20 or 30% of the world's population is still making their living by hunting and gathering. So all of these are different, what we call different modes of production. And they're rooted in economic life, in extracting the means of livelihood, the subsistence from nature. but they also have a cultural aspect. And that is to say that, yes, there is the economy, there are the tools of production, there are the social relationships that exist, the cooperative or antagonistic relationships that exist in all these societies that I'm mentioning, including capitalism. But there is a cultural dimension. That is to say, even these economic relations and so on have a meaning. They have a meaning. They have a significance. The people who carry on this way of life give a certain meaning, a certain significance to all of their activities, their economic activities, their social activities, their religious activities, their amusements. All of these have a sort of a significance, a culture, what we call a cultural meaning. And of course, this sort of understanding things that I'm talking about, namely the significance of culture, develops out of anthropology. Let me illustrate this by the simple act of eating. The simple act of eating. Well, every day at various points of the day, whether you're living in a hunting and gathering society, whether you're living as a peasant on the land in 1500, or you're a worker in London in 1850, at some point or another, people stop and take a meal. Well, these meals have a certain cultural meaning, even to the point that there are certain people who, in terms of basically putting food in their mouth, basically use their hands as a way of just feeding themselves from some sort of common table, etc. They basically use their hands to feed themselves. Others use chopsticks, and maybe they use their hands a bit, but they use chopsticks. Others use forks and knives. Well, there's a history to all of this, and there is a cultural meaning to all of this. And meals also have, very often, a kind of spiritual and ritualistic and religious significance. Taking a meal in the family together, often accompanied by prayers and so on. So what I'm saying is there is a cultural dimension and to all of these acts. And today, scholars are very aware, the influence comes from anthropology, that there is this sort of cultural dimension to all aspects of human activity. And so it is important to study that. And furthermore, the reality is not only does this cultural aspect exist, but the other aspect of this sort of approach is the idea that all of these sort of actions, whether they're economic, whether they're social, whether they're political, whether they're ritualistic, ceremonial, what have you, they all constitute a social totality. Cultures are social totalities. Cultures are social, that is to say, all aspects of them are tied together. And figuring this out is very important. One scholar calls culture or human societies an expressive totality, an expressive totality. It's a totality because all aspects of it come together in a unity, but it's also expressive because it's impregnated with significance. It's impregnated with significance. It resonates with significance, symbolic meaning. And serious study of culture and of civilization requires students to sort of understand this. Now, so I've dealt with that, and is there anybody who has any questions about this or comments? Okay, now I come to civilization. We are going to study a series of civilization: Western European civilization, Islamic civilization, Indian civilization, Chinese civilization, the civilizations of Africa and of Mexico, the Aztecs and the Incas of South America. Those are the civilizations we're going to study. So we have to understand what a civilization is. And here we're touching on the first review question. I'll come back to this in the next class, but this is what I have to say about civilization. Now, where does the term originate? How do we get to the term civilization? Well, in the 18th century, scholars in France and Scotland began to talk about civilization. And that term, they had certain things in mind, some of which were still attributes of societies that were civilization that we still keep. But certainly part of this was the idea that there are certain societies that are civilized. And by the 18th century, these Scottish and French scholars, they certainly thought of their own European society as a civilization. But they also recognized, well, hey, China has a great civilization, and so on. So there was a recognition. But civilization had a positive connotation for most of these scholars. However, it's important to note that there was one scholar who ultimately had a lot of significance, a Frenchman by the name of Rousseau, who was a contrarian. Rousseau in the 18th century, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And basically, he said civilization was a bad thing. He said that civilization means inequality and a loss of freedom. Inequality and a loss of freedom. And certain people, and of course, partly he had in mind the way of life of the hunting and gathering people, the indigenous people of the world. And so there was always from the beginning this contrast between civilization and non-civilization. And some people, starting with Rousseau, had a negative view of civilization. And I would say that in recent times, given how capitalism has developed these problems, some people are looking fondly at hunting and gathering society, arguing maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. And one of these people that does this is this scholar by the name of David Graeber. There is in the bookstores and online a new book by this David Graeber called The Dawn of Everything, which looks back at hunting and gathering societies. It's a massive book and basically argues that the way of life of these people was superior and that civilization was a kind of prison, especially a prison for the ordinary people, the peasants, the craftsmen, the workers, because civilization was established, the argument goes, was established by the landlords, by the state bureaucrats, eventually by the capitalists, has been imposed on the ordinary people through these many centuries, because it's a way in which this upper class can basically live off the labor of the rest of society. Well, Graeber, he doesn't care about inequality. Mainly, he's concerned as because he is an anarchist. Um, he says that civilization has led to a loss of freedom. So there you are. There is this contrary view, which today has a certain presence. That's why I'm mentioning it. Well, anyway, we can say, well, what do we mean by civilization? Well, I've already indicated uh, the the first thing that characterizes civilization is the fact that some people can actually live without working. That is to say, there develops a class, a landlord class, associated with some state administrators and senior military people who actually live off the labor of other people. The rest of society, and at the beginning of civilization, it was mainly peasants, there were some artisans and so on, had to pay part of what they produced in the form of rent to this upper class, who were the primary beneficiaries of this civilization. The rest of humanity, the other 90%, had to keep their heads down and basically pay rent to these people, and basically were forced to work for a living. Well, the rest did not. So the first thing is there has to exist a sufficient agricultural surplus. There has to be enough food to support a group, say 10%, who live without working. So agricultural surplus, the first thing. And of course, this group becomes the upper class in society, in all of the civilizations that we're dealing with and beyond. There exists this, I'll call them what they are, a parasitic group who live off the labor of other people. So the second characteristic is the existence of social class, an upper class that lives off the labor of others, and the rest below, mainly peasants. So agricultural surplus, social class, and coming out of this, the development of mainly to serve the needs of this upper class of towns and cities, the existence of towns and cities appear way back in Egypt and China, in Mesopotamia, and today's Iraq. The first cities come into existence, made up of the landlords live there, the administrators live there, the soldiers live there, and their servants, the artisans who make beautiful things and so on, serve this upper class. So cities come into existence. So we have agricultural surpluses, social classes, cities, and beyond cities, the coming into being in all the societies that we're talking about of the first states, the first political states, because there has to be a general and overall administration and a coercive power that basically enforces this new system. And so you get the development of the first states. And along with that, the first state comes the first state religions. The religions that emerge, and they emerge virtually everywhere, are basically a branch of the state. The priests, the priests certainly are useful in making sure that the land is fertile. They appeal to the gods. They call in the rain, but they also tell the people, obey your masters. And so state religions accompany the development of the state. So those are the basic characteristics: agricultural surpluses, social classes, the development of cities, the development of states and state religion. In addition to that, there does develop people realize that so the people who are the landlord class and the state administrator, we have to keep tabs on people, and we have to keep tabs on the rent and taxes that they pay. So very soon, accompanying civilization comes the development of writing. Writing is all about keeping records, and state records develop. So writing develops as a basic characteristic of civilization. And in addition to that, finally, you get the great temples, the great palaces that appear in all of these civilized society, the great monuments, which of course are built by the ruling class, by the rulers. This is called monumental architecture. Last but not least, in terms of these attributes, is the reality that whereas in hunting and gathering society, the gender relationship that did exist between men and women that developed in hunting and gathering society and still exist were based on a relatively high degree of equality. Sometimes women were leaders in, and still are, in hunting and gathering society. Once you get civilization, forget it. Societies become male dominated. Male domination is enshrined in law, and particularly the passage of property is through the male line. So then, are there any questions about what I've been saying today? Okay. So when did civilizations appear in the first place? Well, civilizations developed in what we call the fourth millennium BC, the fourth millennium before Christ. And the first civilization developed in Iraq, what we call Mesopotamia, or Iraq, 3500 BC, first civilization. Shortly thereafter, in 3100, a civilization appeared in Egypt. In 2600 BC, the first civilized societies appeared in China. In India, the date is 2200 BC. And in Latin America, between 2000 and 1000 BC. Those were the first civilization. So Mesopotamia, 3500 BC, Egypt, 3100 BC, China, 2600 BC, India, 2200 BC, and Latin America, 2000 to 1000 BC. I will break off at this point, and we will look at civilization as it appeared around 1500, the start-off date of this course, starting next time. And I will refer to the first review questions in order to make sure that you sort of understand what I'm looking for in terms of answering these final examination questions. See you on Monday.
Hi, Professor. I have a question.
Yes.
For the first assignment where we answer the questions, does it have to be an essay format, or do we just?
Yes. It has
Yeah.
to be. It has to be an essay format. Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
What kind of format?
What do you mean? It's an essay, an exam.
Like MLA Chicago,
I beg your pardon?
MLA Chicago, like what kind of style?
No. We're talking about answering a test question. There's no annotation here at all. It's an answer to an examination question. It's not an essay. It's not a paper.
He's gonna ask.
Okay, thank you.
Can I ask a question?
Yes,
Sorry, can you repeat the characteristics of the civilization in order?
well, remember, I will, but remember that, this is all recorded, and you can always refer back. In any case, we have agricultural surplus. Secondly, social class. Thirdly, city. Fourthly, states and state religion. Fifthly, writing. Sixth, monumental architecture. And finally, gender inequality between men and women.
Thank you.